Joining me from Blantyre, Malawi, is Tony Sean Mendes, an aviation expert, and we will be discussing this sort of merger coming together of South Africa Airlines and, of course, Kenya Airlines. You are welcome, Sean. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, Sean, the rule of thumb in business ensures or stipulates that there should be some sort of collaboration that would engender growth or survival. Now, looking at the coming together of Kenya Airways and South African Airways, do you think that these two entities are suitable for each other? Do you think that they can work together?
Well, on paper, sure. This is a very good match in theory. However, on a practical level, this is actually an alliance of two bankrupts. Neither South African Airways nor Kenya Airways are a viable business on its own as it currently stands. And I guess their shareholders, which are their respective governments essentially, are hoping that they can work some sort of magic and combine two negatives to make a positive. So while this is certainly a good exercise on a theoretical level, I think the real devil is going to be in the details as to whether they can make this an actual success.
Let's go into the details now. One of the airlines just got bailed out while one is waiting for a chunk of fund just for it to keep operating. Now, looking at these issues, don't you think these baggages could actually scare away would-be investors?
Well, while both Kenya Airways and South African Airways are in similar positions, they're actually in these positions for very different reasons. Kenya Airways was not a badly run carrier for most of its existence, but I think their decision to launch what they called Project Mawingu in 2012 wound up crippling them. Basically, they wound up taking up a huge amount of long-term debt to finance a very ambitious expansion plan at precisely the wrong time in retrospect. This was right around the time where there was a flare-up in the security situation in that region, and inbound tourism to Kenya dropped badly. That left them with a bunch of commitments for aircraft, a bunch of large aircraft, a bunch of new routes that simply couldn't be sustained by the new market dynamics. And I think that's probably the biggest reason why KQ has fallen into such a difficult situation today. South African Airways, on the other hand, has been victim of its government's policies for the most part. The ANC governments in the post-apartheid era have been clear that their national transformation agenda is a higher priority than the commercial success of its state-owned enterprises. Now, that may work for state-owned enterprises that are in areas where the state has a de facto monopolistic position, but not in a globalized industry like aviation. In fact, SAA's market share in its home market has consistently trended negatively over the last 3 decades, to the point where they barely had a 15% market share by the time they suspended their operations in 2020. So yes, there are definitely legacy issues for both the airlines, but the legacy issues for each airline are very different.
All right. I want to believe, Sean, that you are aware of the fact that Kenya in recent times pulled out of an alliance, that is the Kenya Air France KLM alliance in recent times, and it even almost got nationalized in some process. Now, what makes this merger different from the previous collaborations that Kenya has had?
Well, I think the main difference is that the Kenya Airways KLM partnership was a really good thing. In fact, it was a very big essential for both Kenya Airways and KLM when they started it up in 1996. And unfortunately, it was the changing priorities of the market that meant that eventually an amicable divorce was necessary. If you look back to the 1990s and where KLM was, they were a small independent European carrier back then. And, they had to compete with the behemoths like Lufthansa, British Airways, Air France. And the only way that a small country like the Netherlands could do that was by entering into partnerships and alliances. So they entered into a major partnership with Northwest in the USA. Their African strategy was to partner with Kenya Airways. That was very good while it lasted. But in 2004, KLM and Air France Group wound up merging. And Air France had a very different Africa strategy, which was built upon France's own colonial roots in Africa. That meant that Kenya Airways' value to that alliance changed, and it was probably then best for both sides that they figured out a way to split and go their own separate ways. Now, what South African Airways can bring to the table today, or vice versa, what Kenya Airways can bring to South African Airways today in terms of financing, expertise, etc., is very different than what KLM brought to Kenya Airways back in 1996. The only real advantage that both SAA and KQ have and that they can bring to each other is the value of their home markets, which still remain some of the largest economies in Africa.
All right, well, let me put this to you. There was a time that South African Airways got a buffer and was rescued, but in that process, Mawingu was left to fend for itself. Now, looking at this collaboration, if Kenya Airways fails to be profitable, do you think it would be abandoned also to fend for itself?
Well, I think it's too early to determine whether KQ has been abandoned already. I mean, there have been multiple rescue plans for KQ mooted over the years, but so far the only thing that seems to be actually happening over there is the government just throwing more money out to subsidize KQ's losses. KQ's business model needs a structural overhaul, and that is something that they are struggling to do because of their long-term debt commitments. And of course, due to labor issues, which have political undertones as Kenyan elections approach again. So, you know, I don't think KQ is out of the woods by any means, and I definitely don't think that SAA is out of the woods by any means. I think both those carriers need to have a very close look as to what their objective is, both as an independent entity as well as a combined entity.
Well, there's no doubt that there are sort of challenges associated with these two airlines. And of course, discussions will still continue on how they will be able to get out of it. That is by being strategic and putting plans to bear to do that. But then one of the things you mentioned was government interference. And in some climes, they call it political interference. And Kenya Airways Chief Executive Officer, that is Alan Kilavuka, said that governments of Kenya and South Africa are planning to take a minority stake in the Pan-African airline. Now, do you actually think this would last? And will the new Pan-African carrier actually be able to steer off some sort of interference, be it from the government or politically?
You know, no government-backed enterprise anywhere in the world, let alone in Africa, can be truly independent. No. I think both Alan at Kenya Airways and Thomas at South African Airways know this very well. And if they're saying otherwise publicly, I think it just proves the point that they have to please their political masters right now to get their financing rather than openly speak the truth.
So basically, is it a case of he who pays the piper dictates the tune, or do you think there will be some sort of freedom, so to speak, for these airlines to operate and succeed in the operations?
Well, I think, you know, every enterprise has to be able to operate to the objectives of its shareholders. And when a shareholder is the government, the objectives aren't always necessarily the commercial success of the enterprise, but could be other priorities as well, such as increasing employment, you know, political alliances with countries where you need to operate flights and so forth. So as long as the government is involved in any way, the pressure, if not the imperative to do that, is always going to be there. And so true independence is not going to be possible.
All right, before we go on a break, Sean, let me quickly put this to you. Do you think that other African countries can take a cue from these sort of mergers to start a Pan-African airline, so to speak? Or would you even say they even have that capacity to do so?
Oh, most definitely. And I think that if anything, this is actually copying a model that Ethiopian Airlines has been refining over the last decade. Ethiopian strategy for African expansion, you know, for the last 15 years, in fact, probably closer to 20 years that they've been talking about it, has been to develop satellite hubs, so to speak, in different parts of Africa. And that's why they partnered with Sky Airlines in Togo, with Malawi Airlines in Malawi. They've had partners in Chad, in Mozambique, in Zambia, and all over the continent. So I think, you know, that has been a model that has worked well for Ethiopian. It's allowed them to consolidate their market presence, both as the parent brand as well as the satellite brands in these various markets. And if anything, I think that is what is driving the excitement of KQ and SAA shareholders and for the management themselves to try and duplicate that and ideally refine it to be more successful.
Fine. Let's look at what KQ's Kilavuka actually said. He said the focus is on securing backing from a financial institution rather than an industry player like a Gulf carrier. In his words, he said this will help in avoiding a compromise in plans to split long-haul flights between the airlines' respective hubs. Now, do you think this move is the right step to take? Do you actually agree with it, going for a financial institution when you talk about funding than going to an industry player? What do you think?
I think it's probably a bit of a cart before the horse situation. It isn't like there is a wide range of investors lining up to, to put their money into either Kenya Airways or South African Airways because they view it as a viable financial enterprise. This is true, I think, of most of these airlines in Africa. The people who come to the table are doing it because they're using it as a gateway to get in either for other government concessions elsewhere, for, to complement their global business model, or something for the benefit of the investor. So certainly, in theory, I think Alan is absolutely right that a financial institution would give the new entity more independence to be able to take the decisions that are in the best commercial interest of the enterprise itself. But it's not going to be that easy to get a financial institution willing to do that, because the risks of investing in an African airline are quite simply higher than the risk profile that most financial investors are willing to assume.
Well, what makes the risk higher? What are those factors you would say that increases the risk, that makes it more volatile?
Oh, well, I could go on for about an hour on this, but operating airlines in Africa is a very different challenge than operating airlines in other parts of the world. There are challenges in infrastructure, there are challenges in technology and distribution. It's, these are not challenges which can't be overcome. There are a number of African airlines which, especially on localized levels, have been able to overcome these and in fact become very successful by mastering these. But in general, operating an airline in Africa is more expensive than elsewhere in the world as a result of these. You have higher fuel prices, which are driven by the need to import jet fuel for the most part due to lack of refineries. Even when transporting jet fuel, you have to use trucking, which is more expensive than pipelines. You can't fly around the clock to most parts of the continent due to lack of night infrastructure like runway lights, due to lack of security situation to operate at night, which reduces how much you can use the aircraft. So generally, operating an airline in Africa is a very different model and a very different set of expertise that is needed to be successful.
Okay, let's quickly look at the routes of operations now. The new carrier proposed an operational plan where SAA's Johannesburg base would focus on flights to the Southern Hemisphere, while operations to Asia would go through Nairobi, and the hubs will still have the ability to maintain their competing flights, so to speak. So you look at it that there's some sort of arrangements in which airline would go, and another route that another airline would go. But then, do you see these plans? Do you see it as being visible? Do you think that it is profitable, and do you see some sort of increase in demand of routes even as these operations begin to escalate?
Well, I think this is actually, something that is very obvious to people who are in the industry. It's something that South African Airways in particular has tried to do for the last, again, 20 odd years that I've been dealing with them. And, if you look at South Africa's geographical location, South Africa is not a natural hub for anything. It is a regional hub for the Southern African region, and that is driven by the fact that South Africa is the behemoth economically in that region. So a lot of commerce goes through there. But, if you're flying from Nairobi to Paris, South Africa is not a logical connection point. It's not a logical connection point for much other than Southern Hemisphere traffic, like if you're going from Brazil to Hong Kong via South Africa. So the need for South Africa to actually have a secondary hub in, further north in Africa is actually very critical for them to be able to build on their southern base, as well as to be able to expand and show growth in other markets. Because as I mentioned earlier, their market share in their home market has been diminishing consistently. Kenya Airways is in a similar situation because their proximity to a very strong competitor right next door in Ethiopia makes it very difficult for Kenya Airways to dominate in their home region of Eastern Africa. So for them, the benefits of having a partner in Southern Africa with a strong brand presence, with a strong market presence in that region, allows them to look a bit more south to be able to, to expand their home market in that area. So in concept, I think this is a very good idea. And, both South African Airways and Kenya Airways have some excellent people working there in their network team. They've thought this through. I know from working with them over the years that, that this is an idea that they've all dreamed about implementing, and I sincerely hope for their sakes that they're able to at least get it off the ground and get something moving along those lines.
Just to buttress your point, we are aware that the two collaborating carriers are looking at recruiting a third member from West Africa. Now, you look at Nigeria, Ghana, Ivory Coast, or Senegal. Which do you think would give them that propelling that will drive this new investment in terms of partnership? Do you think they will be going for emerging ones, or do you think they would be going for pre-existing ones that, when you look at the airlines, most of them are still in debt?
Again, that is something that is very good in theory. The triangle, the East, West, and Southern African hubs is an excellent concept. And if they can execute it well, it will be very successful. But in practice, finding that partner is not going to be easy. If you look at the West African market right now and the people who are doing well or who are growing in that market, none of them are really in a position to join this alliance seamlessly. I mean, you've got ASky in Togo, which is the big player in West Africa right now, but that is already 40-something% owned by Ethiopian Airlines. So that's not going to be an option for them. You've got Africa World Airlines in Ghana, which is a very good, very strong, profitable regional carrier. But that's pretty much what AWA is doing right now. It is a regional carrier with its market dominance in Anglophone West Africa only. You've got Air Peace in Nigeria, which has got very good ambitions, which is consistently growing, but they are under a cloud as their ownership is facing indictment in the United States on money laundering and fraud charges. So, that may not be a very good option. Then you're looking at state-owned carriers, which are for the most part competing with each other, not on commercial terms, but competing who can suck out the most state subsidies. You've got Air Cote d'Ivoire, Air Senegal, and carriers like that who basically have business models that are designed to boost the prestige of the nation rather than to ever make money. And would that really fit in to an alliance which is supposedly being formed to get away from that model in Kenya and South Africa? So I agree that a West African partner is probably important to the alliance, but I don't actually see one available right now or in the foreseeable future that could fit into a commercially viable alliance.
Okay, Sean, when you look at developed countries, their airline ecosystems and the competition that pre-exists within that ecosystem. Now, we understand that it is fierce, it is more organized, it is more efficient. Now, do you think that this collaboration coming from South Africa Airways and, of course, Kenya Airways can be sustained? Do you think they can survive amidst this efficiency that we have across board all over the globe?
Well, I don't think there's necessarily a need to compete directly against these carriers. I think that, African carriers easily find a niche to complement other carriers flying into Africa. And African carriers can build upon that profitable niche until they reach critical mass where they're able to to fund the losses that may be necessary to win market share away from those. African carriers really need to focus on their strengths, and the strengths that African carriers are in the last mile delivery. There are markets in Africa, and let's say secondary markets in, say, Tanzania, say Kilimanjaro, Arusha, things like that. Those are not markets where Emirates is able to put a daily 777 or an Airbus 380 into. But those are markets where, with the right partnerships with these global carriers, whether it's an Emirates or a British Airways or a Delta or United, you have the ability as an African carrier to partner with them to transport passengers to and from these secondary and tertiary markets and get your share of the revenue. And if airlines start looking in terms of this is what I can uniquely bring to the table, if African Airlines in particular, this is something that I can do that they can't, and this is something that they need me for, they begin negotiations from a position of strength rather than as a position of antagonism. If you're going to try and say, well, I want the full pie for myself and you get out of it, you'll be making an enemy. And in a situation where you're already a loss-making airline seeking to recapitalize and reinvent your business model, that's probably not a fight you want to pick on day one. So I'd firmly recommend that African Airlines build upon what is their strength, upon their niches, upon markets where only they can realistically compete. And once they've got those mastered, then start looking at picking fights with the big boys.
So basically, it's for them to, basically it's about zero competition, focus on your strengths and consolidate on your efforts. Thank you so much, Shawn Mendes. Really appreciate your presence on the show.